So this evening we're hearing a talk by Saeed Haider Ali, which we'll get to in a minute. But I just wanted you guys to preview and have you guys mark your calendars for the other 3 lectures in the series this academic year. On February 6th, we'll be hearing about equitable renewal, reclamation, and repair from Edgar Adams, professor in architecture, and Brian Hendrickson, professor of rhetoric and writing studies. On March 5th, we'll be welcoming Sonia Thomas, who works for the College Unbound program in Providence, who will present, and who is an alumna, who will present her talk, The Story of a Narragansett Indian Tribal Member. And on April 16th, we'll be hearing from a panel of folks from our law faculty and law students and some of our law alumni on educational segregation and inequality in Rhode Island, that is being sort of convened and facilitated by Nicole Disluski in the law school. So all of these events are at 7 p.m. They're all via Zoom. So please, oops, I think I might go wrong. I realize you guys cannot see the slide. I'm so sorry. We're having technical difficulties, but these will end. Okay, so there we go. There's the slide. So please mark your calendars. These will also be coming out via, the usual channels at Roger Williams University. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker and his talk. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Saeed Haider Ali, who is an associate professor of sociology at Roger Williams University. And I'll give you a little bit of his bio and background information about his work. Professor Haider Ali holds a PhD in sociology from York University and has previously taught at Drexel University, OCAD University, and York University. Interestingly enough, he also holds an MBA and previously worked in packaged goods marketing as a product manager and in advertising as a copywriter. His current research is directed to an examination of a society's contemporary relation to its uncomfortable past and present. So this research takes the form of case studies that have to do with a society's memorializing of its cultural inheritance. For example, monuments to figures such as Christopher Columbus, former US presidents and Canadian prime ministers, Confederate leaders, the history of residential schools in Canada that has been taken up in the form of a government inquiry called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the 6-volume report that commission has issued. The issue of book censorship as it relates to the classroom and libraries in the US, and the issue of the prevalence of guns as it relates to the Second Amendment here in the United States. So, Saeed, you could do an entire Hidden Truths series with your areas of research. So we're really pleased to welcome you tonight to talk about your research on commemorative practice and Confederate monuments, reckoning with commemorative and Confederate monuments and analysis. So after your, for those of you who are joining us, please feel free to put your questions and comments in the Q&A for Professor Haider Ali, and we will get to those after his talk. So I'm going to stop this share and turn the podium over.
Actually, then if you could leave the image up, that would be fantastic.
Leave the image up, absolutely.
Yeah, do that, and then I'll ask you in a little bit to put up that one page thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay,
because the image is evocative, right? I mean,
yes.
so I kind of I'm
all
a little
right.
attached to it. I didn't draw it, but I'm attached to it.
Okay, all right, very good.
All right. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for virtually attending tonight's talk. And thank you as well to the organizers of the RWU Hidden Truths series, especially Professor Elaine Stiles, who, as you just met, is our moderator for the evening, amongst other roles that she performs at the Hidden Truths series. In tonight's talk, I'll be using the Confederate symbolic landscape, including the Confederate monuments, the battle flag, and all the other ways in which the Confederacy has been memorialized in the US over the years, as my case for talking about the issue of memorialization and the conflicts it tends to engender. I have to confess that this mode of presentation is not my preference, as it does not permit for one to look the audience in the eye, to move about, to get a sense of who's present, and all the other ways in which being co-present, what Goffman calls face engagement, makes for a kind of intimacy that is indispensable to a lively encounter. What is more, I'll not be using a PowerPoint or anything up on the screen apart from a one-page little summary that Elaine will put up for us momentarily. Rather, I'll be speaking at a pace that I expect and hope permits for listeners to digest what I'm saying. Anyway, so that's the case. That's what we'll be working with. I'm hoping that despite that, the content will redeem or will make up for the limitations of the mode of delivery. So I'll begin by giving you an overview of the talk. And in this way, you'll have a good sense of the arc of the narrative, including the end. Hopefully, even when knowing the end, you'll stay for the whole thing. Kind of like knowing the end of a movie, but still watch it because the story is good. Elaine, could you put that up on the screen? Great. So it's the outline I put is just like has the 5 little parts. So let me talk to them briefly. So what I'll do is I'll present the opposing views in the conflict over the Confederacy, the ways in the symbolic landscape of the Confederacy. And what we'll see is that we're at a deadlock or an impasse where both views imagine themselves as having the truth. Now we have to overcome that impasse. Otherwise, there's nothing to be said. So at that juncture, I'll share with you my method of analysis directed to overcoming that impasse or deadlock. For any of my students in ANSOC 255 in particular who might have joined us tonight, you'll notice that what I'm doing here tonight is no different than what we try to do in the classroom. I mean, obviously in the classroom in a little more limited way because we don't have the amount of research that we can bring to bear on topics in the classroom. So we're not going to take sides in this debate. We're not saying who the winner and who the losers are, which side wins. Rather, we use estrangement or defamiliarization, or what Freud calls the uncanny, to be able to recover the problem. The next phase of the analysis is we'll see part 3. The method permits us to see the ambiguity inherent in memorialization. I'll dramatize that ambiguity for you by citing some examples. In other words, what we're saying is there's always going to be division over who or what gets memorialized. Step 4 of the presentation, we're going to look at the problem that unites the opposing speakers, and that problem is precisely the problem of memorialization. And we'll use an analogy. In this case, the analogy we'll use is that of historic preservation to formulate that problem of memorialization in ways that helps us better understand it and its challenges. However, we do not offer any final resolution or truth. All right, so that's the talk. That's sort of the overview of the talk. All right. So let's go into it. First, the opposing views. Most, if not all of you, know that there's long been ongoing debate and controversy in relation to the Confederate symbolic landscape. The debate stretches back well over 100 years. For example, here is W.E.B. Du Bois in 1931 proposing, after a visit to the South, that a better inscription to include on the monuments to the Confederacy would be, quote, sacred to the memory of those who fought to perpetuate human slavery, unquote. The debate over the fate of the Confederate symbolic landscape pits those who wish to preserve that landscape, such as monuments, against those who wish to have them moved. On the one hand, many, especially Southerners, see Confederate memorialization as a proud symbol of white Southern heritage. They see things such as the Confederate battle emblem as a symbol of heritage, not hate. They see them as tributes to the soldiers of the Confederacy who died, in their view, protecting their home and region. What is more, they see these monuments and the various symbolic aspects of the Confederacy as forms of regional identification for many white Southerners, as forms of cultural distinctiveness, as forms of regional consciousness. And they see all of these things collectively as providing them with a distinctive identity, with a sense of Southern culture. For example, I quote from a researcher who says Southerners retain a strong sense of themselves as different from other Americans. Southern whites apparently, and I'm quoting still, apparently value these symbols and value them explicitly as links with their region's past. Here is a white Alabamian speaking in 1999. And I quote, as a Southern American, I'm tired of being told by others what the Confederate monuments mean to me. Speaking for myself, Southern heritage represents a way of life. It represents a time when you could walk the streets without fear, a time when the little man had a chance to make a life for his family, a time when God's law was above all else, unquote. So that's one side of the debate, the side that sees it as heritage and Southern identity and such. According to the opposing view, the heritage, not hate narrative is a lie. This view sees the battle flag as a symbol of racism and hate, of a history of white oppression of African Americans in the South. A multitude of historians have long shown, for instance, that the lost cause narrative, which is what grounds the whole history of Confederacy, to be baseless. A researcher tells us the Civil War was fought not over states' rights, but over slavery. And this view is supported by the Mississippi Articles of Secession, which reads, and I quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery," unquote. Furthermore, various polls have indicated that most African Americans view the Confederate battle flag as racist and emblematic of 19th century efforts to preserve slavery, as well as 20th century efforts to maintain a segregated South. Here is the contemporary and celebrated African-American novelist Jesmyn Ward explaining the insuperable role that the Confederate symbolic landscape played in her decision to move away from the South, the place of her birth, to the West Coast. And I quote, "I wanted to run away to some place where the specter of all that we have survived and died by is not present in every flag, in every street name, every monument, every vote." Thus scholars generally conclude, unquote, sorry. Thus scholars generally conclude in relation to the competing views, the following. Scholars tell us, one is based in fact and the centrality of slavery to the Civil War and white supremacy in the building of monuments. The other view is based on a fabricated account of a battle over states' rights stripped of the ugliness of slavery. In response to those who argue that their commitment is to heritage, not hate, sorry, let me read that again, my apologies. In response, those who argue that their commitment is to heritage, not hate, interpret this verdict and the instances where monuments and the Confederate flag have been removed as cancel culture. And thus, we're at a deadlock where it is said that there is no common ground. In fact, there's a writer who takes up this topic who precisely names her book, No Common Ground, resulting in acrimony rather than dialogue. The parties have dug their heels in and used whatever legislative forces at their disposal to secure their respective positions. For instance, to combat the possibility of an expungement of Confederate symbols, states and previously the Trump administration have enacted a series of heritage protection acts that forbid the removal of such monuments. Each view then represents and or believes itself to be on the right side of history. In view of how much has already been written on this issue, what can I possibly have to say that would redeem your time here this evening? After all, as the economists would say, your presence here entails opportunity cost. Not quite the vulgar time is money cliche, but that you could have been doing something better with your time, whatever that might have been. So how do we bring together those who refuse to listen to each other, who each believe themselves to be in possession of the truth, so that the deadlock might be loosened by thoughtfulness rather than by force? All right, part two, where I talk to you a little bit about my method that would permit for us to do this analysis. Assuming for a moment that we have the truth, it still leaves unexamined and undeveloped the seen but unnoticed problem that animates the conflict in the first place. And it is that implicit problem, unattended by the conventional debate, that unites the opposing voices and will permit for dialogue. For instance, by way of analogy, if the truth comes out that one partner in a sexually intimate an implicitly exclusive relationship cheated on the other, that truth is not some miraculous answer that resolves the unspoken problem. We have a guilty party, yes, but what is taken for granted is what is the question That is, what problem are we trying to solve? The answer, the truth, only has meaning for the problem that's being struggled over. In this case, in relation to the cheating thing, the thing that's being struggled over, the thing that even makes cheating relevant in the first place, is the problem of marriage or intimate relationships. That is their meaning. Cheating renders marriage as a site of conflict, as a problem whose meaning must be formulated. In other words, cheating, insofar as it is widespread, invites reflection on the phenomenon of marriage. It raises the question of the whatness or the meaning of marriage. For instance, are cheating and marriage mutually exclusive? That so many marriages survive what is called cheating tells us that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. That then demands that we, as Wittgenstein would say, need to renovate, take to be cleaned, as in the laundromat or dry cleaner, our understanding of marriage. The conflict over cheating is an invitation to think marriage anew. It is that problem that needs to be formulated and not taken for granted. That is why no one says that knowing the truth that one person cheated or the other is the end of the story. The truth speaks for itself. Rather, the truth is the beginning of analysis, of thinking about what marriage is and is not. In other words, the real hidden truth is a suppressed dialogue around the unspoken problem. In the case of what we're talking about, the meaning of marriage, rather than the conventional notion of the hidden truth as some fact or set of facts that have been unearthed, as if analysis is archaeology. In the same way, the truth about the Confederate symbolic landscape, whatever that truth might be, is only the beginning for working through a problem that is being struggled over. Michel Serres proposes that the security offered by the truth, inadequate to the task of analysis, means that one has not really or sufficiently left the shore to swim amidst the turbulence. The adventure of thinking hasn't really begun, whereby one must work through the turbulence. Serres has a fondness for imagery and metaphor having to do with water, bodies of water being adrift and so on and so forth. But his point is that turbulence, analysis requires us to work through turbulence. So the only effective way to talk to people who conceive of themselves as antagonists, people who won't talk to each other, is to show them that they're talking about the same problem. In our cheating example, we would show the antagonists that the problem they're tackling is, what is marriage? They're united by the same problem and its inescapable ambiguity, and therefore are part of the same discourse. We point them to a common ground that absorbs and unites them. They think they're antagonists, whereas they're unwitting collaborators united by that common problem. In other words, we say that there is common ground, unlike the opposing sides of the conventional debate around the monuments. And that common ground is the problem that unites the opposing voices. So it's a matter of identifying that common and unspoken problem that animates the conflict. So analysis proceeds by recovering from the competing opinions the problem or question that remains implicit and undeveloped in those opinions, and remakes it into a discourse that, as Hegel and others tell us, invites dialogue. In Hegelese, we say, cancel the opposition and preserve the difference. It is the formulation of that problem that in sociology, Simmel and Weber would call understanding. In this case, having to do with the Confederate monuments and such, the unspoken problem or question that has to do with the phenomenon of memorialization. That is, what is the meaning of memorialization? It is the suppressed dialogue around the practice of memorialization that requires recovery and formulation. And that will require that, as Simmel tells us, we make the practice of memorialization sufficiently strange. That is, we defamiliarize it, or we render it uncanny, as Freud would say, so that it gives up its secrets. And borrowing from Norbert Elias, we would say that our study poses and develops a very wide-ranging problem. It does not pretend to solve it. All right, so our problem is memorialization. So we need to kind of get a hold a little bit as to what memorialization entails first, before we talk about the problem it represents. Monuments, as an instance of memorialization, are a means of providing a society with an inheritance that signals that the society has a pedigree, that it is born and sustained by significant people and ideas. The society is constantly casting about, looking to consecrate its past in order to give its present an inheritance that inspires in ways that might facilitate persistence. In that sense, the past is a collective resource. That such a past might in the future be seen as tainted is a risk that the society must take in order to receive the breath of life that the past provides. Once a person or idea has been consecrated, has been imagined as foundational to the society, attempts at desacralization will often face much resistance, as such an endeavor is seen to be an attack on the very core and character of a people. A people receive much in the way of self-regard from a belief in a heroic, virtuous, enlightened, and magisterial past, a past of sacrifice and the like. To seek to undermine such a vision of its past is akin to character assassination and worse. Memorialization is a way of saying that we're special by virtue of having had in our community those who are distinguished. That is perhaps why, for instance, Italo-Americans are so deeply attached to the memory and memorialization of Christopher Columbus. We look for those who we can honor in order to perceive ourselves as honorable. Similarly, the Order of Canada is an institutionalized mechanism for honoring those who are seen to best reflect Canada back to itself. It is a method of collective affirmation, of trading on their achievements and memory as a means of collective self-validation. In this way, the memorialization, like the eulogy, is more about the group than the one being celebrated. Heritage or tradition provides us with the confidence and security that our collective lives, as imagined and practiced, is grounded in something durable. We might feel that absent of that security, which might be the basis of the narrative of the self, we are without an identity, a sense of self, and thus susceptible to nihilism in the way that any life absent of a foundation is prone. Heritage gives meaning to life, and it is an incentive to more life. Durkheim confirms the ways in which material objects, say monuments, are expressive of sentiments that collectivize or divide a people and permit for the persistence of these ideals and the collectivization or division of a people. And I quote from Durkheim, "In a general way, a collective sentiment can become conscious of itself only by being fixed upon some material object," unquote. For instance, Confederate monuments and other forms of its memorialization. Relatedly, Durkheim further tells us, its object is not to represent or bring to mind a determined object, but to bear witness to the fact that a certain number of individuals participate in the same moral life, unquote. In this case, a shared or collectivized moral life that is deeply tied to the legacy of the Confederacy. Perhaps the monumentality of the monument refers less to its size, scale, chronological priority, or cultural significance in an abstract sense than to the promise it offers to collectivize the people, Alan Blum tells us. What is more, Durkheim further tells us, for the emblem is not merely a convenient process for clarifying the sentiment society has of itself, it also serves to create this sentiment. It is one of its constituent elements, unquote. The monuments not only express the values of the Confederacy, they might be said to also be productive of that moral life. Put differently, and I return to Durkheim again, these latter do not confine themselves to revealing the mental state with which they're associated. They aid in creating it, unquote. The monuments, then, are simultaneously objectifications of sentiments and facilitators and creators of these sentiments. However, those who invoke the heritage as the grounds of their commitment to the Confederate symbolic landscape largely seem to do so as if memorialization is an unreflective practice, absent of the need to ask questions. For example, what is the nature of the heritage that one is affirming? Yet, who or what we heroize and monumentalize is an unstable practice, an ethical struggle, as evidenced by our changing regard for the heroic or the good or the socially just. So what I've just done previously is I've just given us a sense of the place of memorialization in collective life. In other words, it's indispensable to human collectivities. Memorialization has been practiced from time immemorial. But what's interesting about it is that, as I say now, is that it's an unstable practice, always reflecting an ethical struggle. And I'll give you some examples of how it is ambiguous, unstable, and the like. Who we monumentalize will invariably provoke a sense of injustice and partisanship among some. Let's begin with Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who's exemplary here. Lenin was heroized following the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Excuse me. Stalin, during his subsequent rule, ordered all public evidence of Lenin's previous existence erased from view. However, Lenin was resurrected upon Stalin's death under the Khrushchev regime. So there is an example of that instability. Now here, let's listen to the Greeks for a moment. Sophocles, in the tragedy Antigone, precisely dramatized the ways in which that distinction between good and evil is often fraught. That is, the distinction who ought to be memorialized and who ought not be. Recall that the central struggle in the play is whether Polynices, the brother of Antigone and Creon's stepson, ought or ought not be memorialized in the form of a state funeral. Polynices is accused by Creon of treason, of betrayal of the city-state of Thebes. Yet Antigone, his sister, attempts to secure a respectable burial for her brother, viewing him as a hero rather than as treasonous. In Sophocles' account, the two brothers, Polynices and Eteocles, upon the death of their father Oedipus, had agreed to alternate each year the rulership of Thebes. However, Eteocles had decided not to alternate power with his brother after his, Eteocles' tenure expired. Polynices was then expelled by Eteocles and subsequently gathered an army and attacked the city of Thebes in the War of the Seven against Thebes. Both brothers were killed in that battle. King Creon, who had ascended to the throne of Thebes after the death of the brothers, decrees that Polynices is not to be buried or even mourned on pain of death by stoning. Antigone, however, defies the king's order. She's found out and prevented from giving her brother the dignity of a funeral. I take, by the way, the summary of that play from Wikipedia. It was the easiest thing to do. Was Polynices a hero or a villain? This I don't take from Wikipedia. Was Polynices a hero or a villain? Was his betrayal of the state justified or unjustified? Who's correct, Creon or Antigone? In other words, should he have been memorialized or not? Sophocles leaves us with an impasse that cannot ever be unequivocally settled. An impasse is always an ethical collision, as Blum says, over values and meaning, the good that cannot be settled in the form of a reckoning with a definitive answer. The recent debate over the fate of Al Capone's house is another good example of that ethical collision. Capone was, of course, the infamous Chicago gangster of the 1920s and early 1930s. In that debate, one voice says, in relation to Capone's house, it brings unwanted attention to the community, unwanted sightseers, unquote. In other words, the preservation of the Capone house reflects badly on the community, as if the community is sympathetic to the kind of person Capone was, and therefore might harbor more who are like Capone. Yet Capone was an ambiguous figure, seen by many to have been, quote unquote, a modern day Robin Hood. It took a concerted public relations campaign made possible by a fatal misstep in Capone's rivalry with another gang to change how Capone was perceived by the public as public enemy number one. Thus, he became a target of federal authorities who were able to bring him down via a charge and subsequent conviction of tax evasion. Yet, others argue, quote, we think his home is part of the history of our city, the good, the bad, and the ugly, part of the DNA of our city, unquote. What's the right thing to do? Should Capone's house stay up, be memorialized, or be taken down, erased from memory? This echoes those who say, for instance, that the Confederacy and the monuments are part of America's history. Perhaps there is no memorial that is unimpeachable. Martin Luther King? Well, Martin Luther King was accused by the FBI and as evidence of this, that he was, he had multiple extramarital affairs and so on and so forth. And some people condemn him for that, although we showed you earlier that it would be a question of what constitutes marriage, et cetera, et cetera. What about Mahatma Gandhi? he's viewed as a saint by many, and so on and so forth. But another view, some people raise the question of whether he was a pervert. And here's what I mean. I'm not trying to demonize or diminish these people. I'm just showing you that there's always conflict over who we monumentalize. In Gandhi's case, it was implied that he was a pervert because some of you will know that he slept as a means of testing his vow of celibacy. He slept naked with young women who were invited to sleep with him for him to test his vow of celibacy, just to say that, he's committed to that practice. Another instance that helps us think through the problem of memorialization would be the struggle over the canon in literature and philosophy as it relates to ethics. For example, should we or should we not be reading Harper Lee after it was disclosed that she harbors racist sentiments? What about the Nobel Prize-winning German author, Günter Grass, who was later disclosed, he of the tin drum, who it was later disclosed had been a member of the Nazi Youth Party? And what about the British writer, Roald Dahl, whose work has most recently been filmically adapted by Wes Anderson to much acclaim? Dahl is said to have had some decidedly racist, anti-Semitic, and sexist views. By adapting Dahl's work to the medium of film, Anderson is further memorializing Dahl, even though he's aware of the controversy surrounding Dahl's legacy. Similarly, Saul Bellow, in one of his very late novels, Ravelstein, reminds us of Kipling's and Celine's anti-Semitism, the latter evidently rabidly so. Yet Bellow says we must read them, for their value exceeds their despicable views. That is, we must not censor them, restrict or prohibit access to their work. Might the same not be said for our actors? Also, Voltaire too, Bellow tells us, violently hated Jews. But Bellow was more inclined to criticize Voltaire's lack of intellectual seriousness than his anti-Semitism, and would certainly not ban him. The retort might be that these writers are not forced down our throats. Rather, one has to actively seek them out, unlike the monuments which are in one's face. Alternatively, one could argue that they are not as meaningful as Kipling and Celine, but that would be a very weak argument. Yet, they're no different in the sense that they all have the implicit support of the society. To suggest that they're different is to say that they're only a problem if they're visible, out of sight, out of mind. So in other words, the authors would not be a problem because they're out of sight. I have a weird sentence in front of me that somehow in my editing, and it's only one sentence, but I'm trying to parse what I wrote. So what we're going to do, because I can't read it, what we're going to do is we're now going to use we're going to employ estrangement via an analogy to invite memorialization to give up its secret, as Wittgenstein would say, what he calls seeing as. So for Wittgenstein, one way, a powerful way of doing analysis is to see something as something else, right? So what we're going to look at, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to understand memorialization by seeing it as analogous to the practice of historic preservation. So if we look at memorialization through the practice of historic preservation, we might be able to see something about it that would be able for us to better thoughtfully think through the conflict that memorialization of monuments or the Confederate monuments represent. Okay, so I call this section analogy as a way out. We might consider thinking about memorialization as always displaying the tension between necessity, that is the perceived need to memorialize as a way of celebrating ourselves by honoring our inheritance, and contingency, the question of who to memorialize, as almost anyone is susceptible to having their critics or of being seen as gross. So I'm saying memorialization always displays the tension between necessity, that is, we do it because it invigorates us, it breathes life into us, but also, but at the same time, a tension with contingency, because we know that whoever we memorialize is potentially somebody who could be criticized later on, shown to be a monster later on. This is very much analogous to the problem that historical preservation as a practice raises as it relates to heritage and the discourse released under the auspices of such a concern. The discourse on historical preservation points significantly to the need for treating the past with care. and I quote, "An inheritance endows the present with material for which care is required," unquote. This, of course, raises the question of what it means to treat the past with care, as if it is not self-evident. In other words, we don't want to treat it as self-evident because it is not. It needs to be developed. For many, in the specific case we are analyzing, to treat with care means displaying respect for, quote, Confederate ancestors, unquote. And it is precisely those, quote unquote, ancestors that the monuments celebrate. The orientation to those ancestors is evocative of Coulange's sacred fire that meaningfully nourishes and sustains one's place in the world. That means that removal or any form of interference is perceived as an indirect attack against the integrity of a community, reflecting disdain for what the monuments mean as an inheritance. Such an attack, removal or relocation, for instance, is seen to be irreverent towards the inheritance that the monuments bequeath and is believed to fail to live up to the injunction of care. Yet, and I quote, "Note that an inheritance requires not simply conservation, but the kind of care that can modify its shape in the wake of changing circumstances. The notion of inheritance makes heritage into a course of action that introduces the imperative of care and the responsibility to maintain and enhance the legacy, and also the opportunity for revision, vandalism, and even dismembering and destruction," unquote. Here we're being invited to think about what care means. Care means, on the one hand, care isn't just conservation, we're being told, or we're being invited to reflect on. Care also means that we could decide that something is not worthy of keeping. We could revise it, we could vandalize it, we might even dismember and destroy it. So care is both. Care, in that sense, is ambiguous. The best encounter with an inheritance might therefore be one that, quote, "invites the present to review its inheritance, and in this way can be a constant incentive in any present for renewal in the face of powerful but obsolete foundations, those that are insecure," unquote. The debate over the Confederate monuments might then be best seen as an invitation to review the insecure foundations of the society, directed at renewal, with the monuments exemplifying one aspect of that insecure foundation. Okay, I'm almost done. Just so you know, I know I've been reading a fair bit, but this is the only way that I could have delivered this presentation in view of the time constraints I'm working with. All right. Consequently, in relation to injunctions such as heritage protection acts that demand that the monuments are left intact, compare the Trump administration's Heritage Protection Act, for instance, we might ask the following question. If these monuments were made for us as if we are now the future that was anticipated then, how are we expected to use them on any terms other than ours? Recall that despite the insistence of many Southerners that the monuments are exclusively their inheritance, they are in fact a collective inheritance by virtue of their location on public lands. The foregoing question suggests that the present, alive to the imperative of reflective care, has the obligation to do whatever fits with the needs of the present. And that might mean, quote, "mixing in the action of care both indebtedness and an appetite for modification, renovation, and innovation, including the opportunity for vandalism and even dismembering and destruction," unquote. It seems then that in naming the monuments one thing, heritage, or another thing, hate, as our two antagonists have done, each side is trying to fix and stabilize the meaning of that which must remain ambiguous. In a sense, we're saying that debates over memorialization will forever remain irresolvable. Now, that sounds like we're being, how do you say, not nihilistic in this case, but perhaps cynical in that we can never resolve these things. No, it's saying that we must attend to each situation based on the current needs. There is no universal answer, a morality play that some things are unequivocally good and some things are unequivocally bad. We're saying that these things pose a challenge that needs to be worked through. Conclusion. While memorialization might be indispensable to nourishing our collective sense of self, it gives to the future an inheritance that might always also prove to be a burden. The inheritance is then always susceptible to being both a blessing and a curse. That is ambiguous. That ambiguity might be seen in the sense that we can think of the Confederate symbolic landscape not as either heritage or hate, but rather as heritage and hate. The conflict that we just talked about is invariably an example or a case that illustrates a problem to be worked through, the problem of memorialization that is timelessly proven to elude our grasp and remains enigmatic and ineffable. Thank you so much. All right, virtual presentations, there's no applause.
There's no problem. Well, thank you, Said, for that talk and for the issues that you've raised on this topic. And so I'll invite, oh, there's some clapping from the chat. Thank you. So I invite our audience to put your comments or questions for Professor Hyderali in our question and answer queue. And I see we do have one question already from Julia. She asks, what does the world look like without monumentalization? Do the current needs really require them? Are they still relevant? I guess is kind of what she's asking there.
I'm assuming Julia is not asking about these. Is she asking about these monuments specifically, or just monumentalization period?
Just reading her words here. It says, "What would a world look like without memorialization or monumentalization?" Generally. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I don't pretend to be an expert. Let's be clear. I don't really, I'm not an expert in anything. I'm just a guy who thinks about things. So. The way I understand that is that human societies we've always traded on our past. In other words, our past provides us, we look backwards as a way to kind of give us strength, to celebrate our accomplishments, as a way to inspire us in the present and the future. So so if human beings don't, think about the way we relate to our ancestors. Think of the idea of death and cemeteries. Cemeteries are a version of monumentalization, memorialization. So we're kind of using that past. Coulage calls it a sacred fire, right? The sacred fire that we turn to nourish us. Monumentalization is like that, but they'll always provoke controversy because people at some point will say that we've discovered something about this person, or we didn't even think they ought to have been monumentalized in the first place. Yeah, I hope that adequately answers Julia's question.
Well, while we're waiting for some other questions to come in, we have another question. A comment as well from Emily Sarah. And another question here too. So I'll go through some of our comments. So Emily says, having lived in Richmond, Virginia, and present when they took the Confederate monuments down, it was a very tumultuous time. A conversation of not memorialization, but how we interpret sculptural works, new and old, as a public was also very present. Yeah, so I think that gets to what you're talking about the current curation that's happening with this inherited legacy of memorialization. Do you want to respond to that comment at all, Said, or?
No, I don't think it's necessary. Yeah. Incidentally, I'm curious. Yeah, I appreciate the comment, by the way, but thank you. And also, yeah, comments are great. Suggestions, if you've heard the work, and and these things are hard to digest, when we just hear them at the moment. But if there's anything that comes up that you think I could benefit from, like, have you thought of this, or even, have you read this? Those are all welcome, by the way, because this is a work in progress. My work is always a work in progress because it's always unfinished, because it's part of a discourse, and the discourse lives on forever. Just like, to use the example, marriage is never settled. What is marriage is a problem that's always present in society, and we will talk about it from now to time immemorial. We've talked about it from time immemorial to now, and we will talk about it forever. And we will talk about monuments too forever.
All right. All right. Well, thanks very much, Emily. We also have a question from Maya. They write, can't everything be considered monumentalization or memorialization, I guess, in some way? How can we deal with this? So, and perhaps thinking about all of the things we put on in our paths, I suppose. Explicit and implicit monuments, perhaps, or something to become accidental monuments, right? We don't intend them to be monuments or memorials, but they end up that way sometimes. So how can we deal with this? It's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, that was, I mean, so I think if I'm hearing what Maya is kind of trying to get at is some version of our material past. So culture. Let's try. So you know, if we were looking at it from, say, you know, a sociological, anthropological point of view, culture is a version of, you can call it, now I don't want to use the word monumentalized, because if everything is monumentalization, then nothing is monumentalization. You know what I mean? So we have to try to retain distinctions. But I think what she's saying is that, you know, like in a way, think of a food culture or something, right? When we have recipes, that's our way of kind of saying that that thing ought to be preserved, ought to be kept, that recipe is worthy of something. And that's kind of what we do with monumentalization. When we monumentalize, we're saying that thing is worthy of being kept, or as, you know, Berger and Luckman say, you know, objectified. We objectify it, right? We say, look, yeah, it's a good thing. Let's keep it. That's how culture works. Right? Culture, the accretion of culture, or the accretion of culture, if however one pronounces that, is based on this idea of objectifying things that we think are valuable. But also part of our cultural inheritance is also that we're always revisiting and rethinking. We're always making and remaking, making and unmaking. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, is we've made certain things, and in some cases we unmake them based on say, if we're sufficiently agreed that the thing, it's time for birth, death, and renewal. How's that? Birth, death, and renewal. Something comes into existence, and sometimes it needs to die for a variety of reasons. So that's the only way we can handle it. If anyway, Maya, I hope that helps a little bit, or at least part of a conversation. Yeah.
All right. So we have a comment from Christopher. It says, some groups may usurp historical symbols or monuments to represent their current agenda. Some of these symbols are hateful, like Nazi insignia, and I do not think that representation is ambiguous. How do we distinguish historical memorialization from repurposing symbols for hateful groups? I often don't know what to think when I see that yellow "don't step on a snake" flag, for instance. I think here Christopher is talking about the "don't tread on me" flag that has been adopted by the right from American culture.
Yeah. So in this case, I think Chris is using the example of the Nazis or something, that some version of some things are unequivocally, unambiguously what they are hateful. So that would be like a version of the truth, you know. Okay, so they're hateful, but as we would say, it's not, or as I would say, based on an inheritance, my own inheritance of theorizing, is that truth is the beginning of theorizing, of thinking of a problem. So you would kind of have to say, what problem? So I wouldn't argue with you over whether the Nazis are hateful or not. I would kind of say to you, in relation to that, what problem are we talking about? You know, you would have to situate it in the context of something. To say it's hateful, I mean, I wouldn't, you know, you know, Durkheim says, you know, sociology is the analysis of opinions. In other words, or, you know, Plato talks about correct opinions. Durkheim borrows it from Plato, I would think. The idea is that we would need to situate that as part of a discourse. Chris, I hope you know, I hope that makes sense to you. But we would have to situate it as part of a discourse to talk about it. In other words, we would have to inject meaning into it, apart from, say, its hateful context, because that would be the end of the talk. If it's just hateful, Well, but it's there. It's part of something. It's part of a discourse. That's what Arendt did, right? Arendt said, in Eichmann in Jerusalem, Arendt didn't say, well, Eichmann was hateful and Eichmann was, deserving of death and so on. Arendt said, look, what's the Nazi, this Nazi phenomenon? What is it about? What's its meaning? And, that's where she got the banality of evil, right? She says, look, evil is banal, right? And if so look at that discourse that she develops around this idea of hate that is truth definitive. Nobody's going to deny that Eichmann is hateful, right? That Eichmann carried out, Nazi sentiments and wishes and so on. But that's the point. You have to do something with it. That's what we would say the beginning of analysis.
Well, I'm going to use, I guess, I don't know, co-host privilege to ask a question myself. When we talk about historic preservation or tradition or heritage, the things that we talk about that we inherit from the past or that are passed down to us, and certainly things like Confederate monuments fall into that camp. I always stress to my students that these things are in the past, they're about the past, but they are 100% being used as tools in the present, right? So similar to Chris's comment, I think we probably all can agree that that's the case. So, I think one of the challenges in thinking about these objects is that, and I think what it sounds like you're encouraging, I understand you're encouraging us to do is to think about, well, what are those needs in the present, right? And we have these two terribly competing sets of desires and that are being pulled out, and that are being played out in the public realm and in our communities right now. So I say, I think my question is, if you were being called in as a consulting sociologist, right, for a process where a community is trying to decide, what to do with these monuments. For example, I met the curator of the museum in Richmond that has taken possession of the monuments that were removed from Monument Avenue in Richmond. And you have to figure out, what are they going to do with these objects? That's a museum of African American history, right? That they're the ones who have received these items. So, when you're thinking about those kinds of conversations, what's your advice, or, how can the sort of ideas that you're talking about here be applied in those situations? How can that support a public process, or what does that public process maybe start with or look like? Because I'm being on the public side of it. I love your advice.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I'm a sort of reluctant advice giver, and as I speak in the classroom. Sociology is directed to showing us the challenges that we have to contend with, but sociology doesn't pretend to have the answers. I mean, we just say here, here are the problems, here are the issues that are raised, and people have to work it out. Once you provide people, with a mechanism for looking at things, it's dangerous. It's dangerous when we think that there are people who have the answers, like so-called experts. Hey, so tell us what to do. No, I mean, that's sort of the price of democracy. We don't live in plutocracies and various other even philosopher kings or any such thing. What you try to do, and this is what scholarship and teaching and all is directed towards, is giving people the resources, or helping people have the resources to problem solve. So, I mean, advice in that case could be cheap, because, what do I say? And also another part of that is this notion of morality, as if, morality is based, there is no timeless morality as such. The moral order is always shaped, how do you say, spatially and what's the word I'm looking for time. It's a function of time and space. So that there is some notion of a timeless morality is a pretty presumptuous notion. So I would say, if asked to come in to provide perspectives, I would try to show people, as I said in the talk, is you're united by a problem that you're trying to solve. That's it. You are not antagonists. You're collaborators trying to work through a problem. And so my analogy of historical preservation is a way to help you see the problem a little differently. You know, Calvino calls it indirection. Calvino says if you look at a problem directly, you know, he uses the metaphor, you know, whatever, Icarus flying too close to the sun or whatever, or you're blinded by the sun and so on and so forth. You need to look indirectly. So we can help people to have a different look at the problem, but they still gonna have to work it out. And that's the price of democracy. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like you're saying, you know, it's that collaborative, it's trying to be a bit more collaborative about those projects, I suppose, in the present. Yeah, and I think that's very difficult. Yeah, I think that is very difficult because
it is very difficult. That's the thing we're dealing with
because we don't live absent those other things. Yeah, right. Yeah, this challenge of it. Yeah, for sure.
That's what we're faced with. We're faced with innumerable challenges that we have to work through, and all we can do, you know, is okay. So another okay, a simple way of putting, you know, there's the old give a person a fish and they'll eat for a day, teach them how to fish and they'll eat for a lifetime. It's the same notion with problem solving. You help people to see how you might go about attempting to solve problems. You don't solve it for them, right? I mean, I know we live in a culture that promotes this idea of the expert. You know, I mean, that for me is laughable. You know, the idea of the expert who's going to come in and solve my problems. You know, people
just
can
to clarify, I was asking more about process. You
know,
yeah,
no, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the framework of mind. Yeah, versus saying this is an outcome or this is what you guys. Yeah.
So I apologize, but no, Elaine, what I mean is you know, when asked to how to you're always, you know, the expert is always on the horizon. I'm not suggesting you were thinking that, but that echoes, you know, and if you can hear the echo, that's all.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I wouldn't be so rude to tell you.
No, that's okay. No, I think it's just, you know, it's an interesting perspective. And I was trying to think, you know, what would that public process look like? Or, you know, what would that meeting be titled? You know, sort of, you know, and just in thinking of what's a way to introduce those perspectives. And I'm sure there's models. I, you know, was just curious about, you know, since you've studied it so intensively, what that might look like for you.
I hear where you're coming from. No, thank you.
Well, we have maybe time for one last comment or question if there's any takers. All right, well, we are just about at the end of our time, so I will close us out by saying a big thank you to Professor Hyderali for joining us and for talking to us about his research. And thank you all for joining us and for your comments and questions. And we hope we will see you in the spring semester at the next Hidden Truth series lecture on February 6th. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Really enjoyed this. Thank you for taking the time to come and talk with me. Have a good night. Bye. Thanks again, Elaine. Cheers.
Sure. I'm just going to stop our recording.